Welcome to Deep Dive. Today we're taking a closer look, a really deep dive into a topic that's, well, it's constantly in the headlines, isn't it? And it impacts so many lives and industries. The H-1B visa program right here in the United States. We've gathered a lot of fascinating insights and discussions, from everyday experiences shared online to some really in-depth academic research. And our mission today is simple: unpack it all. We want to explore what this visa is really about, why it's become so pivotal for companies and individuals too, and also how recent policy shifts might be changing the whole landscape. So get ready for hopefully some surprising facts and maybe a few aha moments, because this deep dive is all about getting you truly well informed and quickly. So let's start with the absolute basics. What exactly is the H-1B visa, and what was its original purpose? What problem was it meant to solve?
Right. So the H-1B visa, it actually came about from the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1990. Its core design is for temporary employment, specifically for foreign-born workers in what they call specialty high-skill occupations. Think of it as a specific tool, a way for U.S. employers to bring in particular talent they might need, and it's usually tied to the company that sponsors them, the sponsoring employer. Initially, it lasts 3 years, but there's a possibility of renewal, and then down the line, potentially green card sponsorship.
Okay. And we often hear about it almost exclusively sometimes in the context of the tech sector, Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
Is that really where most H-1B visas are used?
Yeah.
Or is the picture broader?
That's a very common focus, yeah. But it is a bit of a misconception if you look at the whole picture. Tech is definitely a major area, no doubt about it. But H-1B holders, they're found across many, many industries. The data shows a really significant presence in, say, education, professional services, finance, healthcare, information sectors, even manufacturing. The core idea, the principle behind it, is always about addressing specific labor requirements. Skill shortages where the domestic supply might be limited at that moment.
Ah, I see. So it's much wider than just coding jobs.
Exactly. It's really about specialized skills across the board.
Okay, that definitely clarifies the foundation. But here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because we see totally conflicting views on whether hiring H-1B employees is cheaper or actually more expensive for companies. What's the real story there? It seems contradictory.
It is complex, and that's because there isn't just one answer. It really depends heavily on the kind of company we're talking about. Take small to mid-sized companies, for example. For them, it can often be significantly more expensive, much more than hiring an American worker.
More expensive? How come?
Well, there are substantial fees involved. Visa fees, legal costs. Plus, there's the requirement to pay what's called a prevailing wage. And that prevailing wage can sometimes be above what they'd normally pay in their local market for that role. It can be quite prohibitive. We even see cases where companies hire someone initially on OPT, that's optional practical training for students, but then find the actual cost of sponsoring the H-1B visa itself is just, too high to justify moving forward.
Right, that makes sense for smaller businesses maybe struggling with cash flow. So why then would the big players, the large established companies, the Fortune 500s, why would they choose this route if it's potentially more expensive for them too? What's the driving force?
That's a great question. And for these larger firms, the data and what they often report themselves suggests H-1B employees do frequently cost them more. They have the same visa fees, but they also typically have robust legal and HR departments. They're very careful about compliance, avoiding any hint of wage discrimination lawsuits that costs money too.
Okay.
So for them, the primary driver usually isn't about cutting costs. It's about gaining a competitive edge. It's about accessing the absolute best global talent, especially when they're trying to hire maybe thousands of tech professionals or people with very niche, very specific skill sets that are genuinely hard to find domestically in the numbers they need.
So talent acquisition on a global scale.
Precisely. And there's another angle some suggest too, that H-1B workers might be perceived as more dedicated or perhaps less likely to jump ship quickly. Because their legal status, their ability to stay in the country, is directly tied to that specific job. It creates a certain kind of stability for the employer, perhaps.
That's a really crucial distinction between the types of companies. But it still leaves that other narrative hanging, the one we hear a lot about H-1B being used specifically for cheaper labor. If it's often more expensive for direct hires at major firms, how do we reconcile that persistent argument? Where does that idea come from?
Right. That narrative often points towards the practices of certain, let's call them consultancies or third-party firms, sometimes controversially referred to as body shops.
Okay, what do they do differently?
These firms operate as intermediaries. They recruit foreign workers, sponsor their H-1Bs, and then essentially contract that labor out to other client companies. Now, some of these firms might pay only the minimum required prevailing wage, which might be lower than the market rate at the end client's location. And sometimes, unfortunately, they might engage in questionable practices, like charging certain costs back to the employee, or maybe underpaying relative to comparable direct hires. They can also potentially exploit that tight link between the employee and the sponsoring consultancy. It makes it much harder for the H-1B holder to, say, leave for a better offer or demand fair treatment.
So it's the model that enables potential undercutting, not necessarily the visa itself.
In many cases discussed, yes. Research does indicate that for roles filled through these kinds of firms, the H-1B wage claims might cluster at the lower end of the permissible scales. So the real aha moment here, I think, is that it's not one single truth. The cost argument is really a tale of two different systems. You have the ethical direct hires, often at large companies, where it frequently costs more. And then you have this intermediary or body shop model, where the program's structure can be exploited for lower labor costs. It depends heavily on who is doing the hiring and how.
That clarifies so much. It really breaks down that seemingly simple question into different contexts. Okay, so we've looked at the company side. Let's shift focus now to the experience of the H-1B worker themselves. We've heard it described as incredibly unstable, really challenging. How profound is that instability?
Oh, it's profoundly impactful. It really touches almost every aspect of their life in the United States. The fundamental issue is that the H-1B visa ties an individual's entire legal right to live and work here directly to their specific job with their sponsoring employer.
Meaning if they lose that job.
If they lose that job through a layoff or any reason, they typically have a very limited grace period. Sometimes it's just 60 days. In that short time, they have to find a new employer who is willing to go through the entire H-1B sponsorship process for them. Or they have to leave the country. It's incredibly high stakes.
Wow, 60 days. That's intense pressure.
It is. And then, layered on top of that, many H-1B holders need to get their visa physically stamped in their passport, usually by visiting a U.S. consulate in their home country, often every 3 years when renewing. And each time they do that, there's a risk, however small, of denial upon re-entry. So even travel becomes fraught with anxiety.
And the green card process doesn't necessarily alleviate that quickly.
Not at all, especially for individuals from certain countries with large backlogs like India or China. The wait time for an employment-based green card can be staggering. We're talking estimates of 25, maybe even 30 years in some cases. Decades. And during that entire wait, they remain tied to the H-1B status and its limitations. All this creates immense pressure. It significantly limits their leverage when it comes to asking for promotions or raises or even just seeking fairer treatment compared to their colleagues who are U.S. citizens or green card holders.
That paints a really clear picture of vulnerability. It makes you wonder, given all that instability and risk, why do people still pursue this path? What keeps them here?
That's the other side of the coin. It really speaks to the powerful pull factors. Many H-1B holders endure these challenges because they genuinely perceive the quality of life, the professional opportunities, the potential for innovation here in the U.S. as significantly better than what might be available in their home countries. For some, especially in tech, it might actually be easier to land a job at a top global company in the U.S. than it would be to get a similar position back home, where those elite opportunities might be fewer or pay less.
So the long-term potential outweighs the short-term anxiety for many.
For many, yes. The perceived long-term benefits, the career trajectory, the life they can build often seem worth the undeniable stress and uncertainty of the visa itself.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have the worker's perspective, the pressures, and the motivations.
Yeah.
But let's zoom out again to another major point of contention we see in the discussions. This is the argument that the H-1B program actually harms American workers, that it's designed to displace them, or that the whole idea of a skill shortage, especially in tech, is maybe overblown or even a myth. What do the materials say about that perspective?
Yes, that's a very strong and persistent critique of the program. Critics argue that it can, and sometimes does, lead to the displacement of experienced, often older U.S. workers. The argument is that they might be replaced by H-1B workers who might be younger and potentially command lower salaries, even if meeting the prevailing wage. Some studies we've looked at actually question the existence of a broad overall tech labor shortage. They suggest instead that what might be happening is a preference within some HR departments to filter out candidates perceived as too expensive, which often impacts older, more experienced workers, maybe those over 35.
So less a shortage of talent and more a shortage of talent willing to work at a certain price point.
That's one interpretation presented, yes. There's also a concern raised that the program, somewhat paradoxically, might actually facilitate offshoring in the long run. or even discourage U.S. students from pursuing STEM fields because the influx of global talent could potentially depress wages, especially in entry-level or academic positions. For instance, one rather striking academic perspective highlighted a time when the National Science Foundation itself apparently advocated using the H-1B program as a tool to keep PhD salaries from rising too quickly, essentially by increasing the labor supply.
Wow.
It's also noted in some analyses that the demographics lean young. Most H-1B holders are under 30, and some argue that perhaps only a relatively small percentage represent the truly elite, best and brightest globally, suggesting the program's use might be broader than just filling gaps with uniquely exceptional talent.
Those are definitely powerful counter-arguments challenging that simple skill shortage narrative. Let's shift now to look at how actual policy changes have played out. There was a significant shift back in 2004. The H-1B cap was reduced substantially, but universities were made exempt. What was the real-world impact of that specific change?
Right, this is a fascinating case study in policy consequences, some perhaps unintended. When the annual H-1B cap for the private sector became binding again in 2004, it dropped back to 65,000 visas, plus an extra 20,000 for those with U.S. master's degrees or higher, starting in 2005. It suddenly became much, much harder for foreign graduates to get those private sector jobs. The competition intensified overnight.
So what happened to those graduates?
What the research showed quite clearly, especially for STEM students coming from countries that were heavily reliant on the H-1B like India, was a noticeable shift. There was an 8.6 percentage point increase in their likelihood of ending up working in academic institutions instead of private companies.
Because universities were exempt from that cap.
Exactly. It strongly suggests that a significant number of students were effectively settling for academia, not necessarily because it was their first choice, but because it offered a cap-exempt pathway. It was a way to stay in the U.S. and keep their career moving.
So if they were settling for these academic jobs, were they still working in their chosen fields? Or were they just taking any available position?
Interestingly, the data suggests the latter in many cases. These individuals who shifted to academia post-cap were significantly more likely to take jobs that were actually unrelated to their specific field of study. It reinforces that idea that they were accepting roles that maybe weren't a perfect fit, primarily as a strategic move to remain in the country and stay on a path toward potential long-term residency.
That's a really unexpected consequence. What about the private sector side during that time? How did the stricter cap affect who did manage to get an H-1B?
On the flip side, in the private sector, things changed too. For those H-1B dependent workers who were hired after the cap became binding and visas were scarce, their wages actually tended to increase, and they were more likely to hold postgraduate degrees like masters or PhDs.
So companies got more selective.
Precisely. Facing a much tighter supply of visas, private firms seemingly became much more selective. They prioritized candidates who were arguably more highly qualified, perhaps justifying the higher prevailing wages and the effort of sponsorship. It really shows how policy levers can create quite different, sometimes counterintuitive effects across sectors.
Fascinating. Okay, so looking ahead now, there's a lot of talk about another potential major shift. Moving away from the traditional H-1B lottery system towards a wage-based selection system. That sounds like a fundamental change. What would that actually mean in practice?
It would be a very fundamental change, yes. Currently, the H-1B lottery for the visas subject to the cap generally operates on an equal chance basis. If you meet the basic criteria, your application goes into the pool, and it's largely random selection. The proposed wage-based system would scrap that randomness. Instead, it would prioritize applications based directly on the salary being offered by the employer.
Higher salary, better chance.
Essentially, yes. Jobs offering higher wages, typically categorized into tiers, would get preference in the allocation of visas. The stated goal behind this proposal is usually framed around protecting American workers by ensuring visas go to the highest paid, potentially highest skilled roles, and making sure the program contributes significantly to the U.S. economy.
Okay, I can see the logic from that perspective. But what does this potential shift mean for the talent pipeline, especially for international students just graduating and trying to start their careers here? How would it impact them?
This is where significant concerns arise. A wage-based system could severely disadvantage entry-level international students. Fresh graduates, almost by definition, usually start at lower salary levels, especially if they're entering competitive fields or joining startups or smaller companies.
Right, they don't have the experience yet to command top dollar.
Exactly. So under a wage-based system, even highly qualified graduates could find themselves pushed to the very bottom of the queue or potentially excluded altogether simply because their starting salary isn't high enough, regardless of their skills or potential. It puts enormous pressure on them to somehow negotiate much higher starting salaries right out of the gate, which is, frankly, very difficult without years of experience.
And what about the employers?
Yeah.
Especially smaller ones or nonprofits.
It poses real challenges for them, too. Smaller companies, startups, nonprofits, even some academic institutions, they might not have the resources to compete on salary with large tech firms or financial institutions for entry-level talent. They might still desperately need skilled individuals, but under a strict wage-based system, they could lose out on sponsoring promising foreign graduates simply because they can't offer a top-tier starting wage.
So for those international students who are currently in the U.S., maybe studying now and hoping to build a career here, what are the practical implications if this change goes through? What should they be thinking about?
Adaptability and strategy become absolutely key. They need to be incredibly proactive. We're already seeing universities ramping up support, offering workshops on alternative visa options, things like the O1 visa for extraordinary ability, or exploring direct employer-sponsored green cards earlier, though these pathways are often much more demanding and have higher bars to clear.
So H-1B might not be the default path anymore for many.
It might become much harder, yes. The optional practical training, OPT, and its STEM extension will remain absolutely crucial as temporary bridges. But beyond that, students are increasingly being advised to focus on building highly specialized, in-demand skills, to maybe target sectors or specific roles known for higher starting salaries. Aggressive networking becomes even more critical, finding those opportunities in employers who can meet potential wage thresholds. And crucially, everyone needs robust backup plans. This might mean seriously exploring career opportunities in other countries that perhaps have more flexible or predictable immigration policies. Diversifying their options is becoming essential.
This has been a really comprehensive look at such a multifaceted system. So pulling it all together for you, our listener, trying to make sense of this complex landscape. What's the big picture, the main takeaway?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the H-1B visa program is undeniably a critical piece of the puzzle in global talent mobility. It was designed at its heart to fill specific high-skill needs and, yes, contribute to economic growth. However, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It exists within this really complex, dynamic interplay of economic incentives for companies, crucial protections needed for workers, and the very real, very personal aspirations of individuals seeking opportunity. The constant debates we see about wages, about potential job displacement, about the immense challenges faced by the visa holders themselves, they all just underscore how incredibly multifaceted immigration policy truly is. There are rarely simple answers. And the changes we're seeing, both recent ones and proposed shifts like the move towards a wage-based system, they really highlight this ongoing evolution, a constant recalibration of how best to attract and retain talent while trying to balance various, sometimes competing national interests. It's a system that's always in flux, and its effects are really far-reaching.
That's a great summary. It's such a powerful reminder that these policies, which can seem abstract, have truly profound impacts. They shape not just entire industries, but individual careers, life choices, families, and even the global flow of skills and innovation. It's a system with so many layers, and understanding those nuances, as we've tried to do today, is just so important. And that does wrap up our deep dive into the H-1B visa program for today. We genuinely hope this exploration has given you a clearer, perhaps more nuanced picture of its complexities, the different viewpoints surrounding it, and what it all means for individuals, for companies, and for the broader economy. There's always more to learn, always more to explore, of course, but being truly well-informed on critical subjects like this is invaluable. All the best, and we will meet again with another important subject in the next meeting.